So we're going to start talking about local government today. We're going to talk about the different types of county positions and how we break down our local government. It's important in a lot of ways, as you'll see here. Okay, about 85% of the state's population now lives in urban areas. We've gone from very rural to very urban. We now rank as the 12th most urban state, and Austin is now one of the fastest growing cities in the United States and is the fastest growing here in Texas. So the cities are getting bigger. San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, even here in the Valley, we're seeing an increase in population. Local government, in many ways, is the most important government. They're our first line of contact. They're the most responsive to us. If you wake up one morning and you have no water in your apartment, who are you going to contact? Local water company, right? You're going to talk to City Hall. There's a FOIL order that's going to come from the local government. Those of you who have children, PTA, right? School meetings, all of those are important. And of course, we have local news sources that let us know what's going on. On election day, there was a polling place in New Mexico where the machines weren't working. So they had to reroute voters temporarily. It was important that people knew about that. You don't want to show up to your polling place, find out you can't vote there, and then have to go somewhere else. Because local government is our first source of contact, in a lot of ways it is our most important source of contact. And the type of government is going to vary by county because Texas is such a huge state. We've got Loving County that has 134 people in the entire county versus Harris County with 4.3 million people. We can't have the same type of government in a county of 134 people. We have in a county with 4.3 million. Counties are important because they keep track of state records like titles, deeds, court records like custody or divorce hearings, state taxes, and state elections per county. Also, once the federal government gives the money to Texas, Texas distributes it to the counties, and the counties decide where the money's going. Now, the problem with this is that the state can't really hold the counties. If they make a mistake, there's no real accountability because county officials are elected. They're not appointed. So the state government can try to get them to do something, but doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to do it. They're going to be more beholden to the voters of their county than they are to the government in Austin. This is also why there was that lawsuit against the governor when he wanted to limit one ballot drop-off box per county, Harris County said, "You want one drop-off box per county of 4 million people? No freaking way." So that got overturned, and fairly quickly. What the state has done is to set up every county to have the same structure, regardless of size. So every single county has a commissioner's court. And this is essentially the various administrative, legislative bodies of each county. State council, judges, and so on. Where there is a difference is in the ability for cities that have more than 5,000 people to apply for home rule. Home rule gives them the ability to organize the government however they want. They get to choose the type of city government they have. If it's with a mayor, if it's run by a council, etc. In that sense, cities do have some ability to differentiate from the pre-existing county government. Again, because the counties are created by the state, every county has to have the same basic form of government. It's only the cities that can differ a bit. They divide the county into 4 precincts, and those precincts choose the commissioner of the commissionerate. There's also a county judge who presides over this court. These are elected positions, and they are partisan. So they run as Democrats, Republicans, or Libertarian. It may surprise you that we don't actually have the most local governments of any state. Illinois does. For whatever reason, they have the most local governments of any state. Okay, so in terms of figuring out how to portion or reapportion a county, they do create precincts. And precincts exist to help re-elect the commissioners and to divide the county road mileage on an equal basis, or as close to equal as possible. Unfortunately, what we tend to see is the creation of precincts that will vary significantly because of the population. The state legislature controls the electoral districts. Usually, they are supposed to be roughly equal based on size. Unfortunately, what we tend to see happening is creating districts where you pack a whole bunch of minorities into that district and then create a separate precinct that's smaller, packing minorities into one district so you can keep the state largely Republican. This is common in all 50 states. Democrats in the state legislature try to keep the state Democrat. Republicans try to keep the state Republican. In 1968, the Supreme Court did rule that you have to follow the rule of one person, one vote, that every vote should matter, and that the districts should be roughly equal in size. You can take their county and create 2 precincts and say, yeah, that's good enough, right? Too many people. That's not a fair division. They are supposed to be roughly equal in size. Give people the ability to have some competition in their precinct. And if we don't follow that rule, then the federal courts can tell the state, you will redo this or else. Redistricting is going to happen probably in the legislative sessions 2021 and 2023, because we just had another census. So in all likelihood, Texas will probably get another 3 to 4 new congressional seats. The state will have to create new election districts. Now, because the majority party in the state legislature is Republican, they will try to draw the districts up to their advantage. If it's too blatantly obvious, though, they can be taken to the federal courts and forced to redo the map. You can't just set it up and be like, 3 out of 4 districts are Republican, we're done here. No. If they try to do it in a way that's clearly unfair, there will be legal challenges, and a federal court will probably overturn that redistricting. We're probably going to get new seats, but we're going to have to see how the legislature handles this. If they try to create it in a manner that's at least somewhat fair, or if they try to throw it to the Republican Party to maintain their majority. And if you look at what happened in the election, the majority of the Republicans in the presidential election is getting smaller. was like 11% in 2012, 9% in 2016, and a little under 6% this time around. So Texas couldn't be called until after 11 p.m. on election night. That's pretty rare. Usually they can call it early. They couldn't this time around. So Texas is on the verge of becoming a swing state. And how they draw up the new districts could make a difference in how soon that happens. It could be as early as 2024, or it could take a little longer. But I think what both parties learned in this election is you can't take Texas for granted anymore. So you better get your people there. Okay, in terms of the Commissioner's Court, they set the tax rate for the county in terms of things like property taxes. They administer the state programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and welfare. They decide how much money local programs get. So again, the federal government allocates money to the state gives it to the counties decide how to spend the money. We spend it on new schools, road improvements, fixing the drain problems. That's going to be up to the Commissioner's Court. They're also responsible for providing health care for poor citizens. They can do this by operating a public hospital where you have to treat poor citizens or anyone regardless of income. Pay a public hospital in the next county to provide health care for poor citizens. To pay a private hospital to take care of them. If you show up at a hospital, regardless of income, they are required by law to treat you. Even if you don't have insurance, they cannot turn you away. The idea behind this is, if you're homeless or you're living below the poverty line, you probably can't afford to go to the hospital. What happens is usually the county will set aside money to help pay for the health care bills for poor people who have to go to the hospital. Counties also have to build and maintain the various county jails. Usually these are holding places for people awaiting trial before they move on to a state prison. They also have to provide for health and safety services and subdivision regulation. They're in charge of things like building hospitals and libraries. And also, how do you handle new subdivisions? So where my parents live in San Antonio is technically not within the city of San Antonio. It's technically considered outside of the city, but part of Bexar County. But they're still able to draw on San Antonio services like water, recycling, and so on. They decide what subdivision counts as part of the city and what would be considered part of the county instead. They also conduct the general and special elections and set the precinct lines. On election day, they'll facilitate the primaries and the general elections. They'll decide where to have early voting, the buildings for each precinct on election day, making sure the machines are working, that there's poll watchers, observers, and so on. And this was especially important this year. There was a lot of concern about potential voter intimidation, voter fraud. So we had thousands of volunteers across Texas keeping an eye on the polls, trying to make sure people weren't trying to intimidate voters one way or the other. Electioneering is allowed outside of the polling place. Once you get inside, you can't walk up to people and be like, vote for my candidate or else. So you need impartial observers to make sure no one's suppressing the vote, attempting to limit the vote or intimidate voters. This year, companies are actually offering people paid days off to go work at the polls. Old Navy said, we'll give you your regular salary if you'd work a shift or two if you go work at the polls. So that was actually really good because we had more people able to actually volunteer for this election to help out and make sure it didn't go sideways. Right, so in terms of the various county officials that exist, the county commissioners are in charge of the road and bridge projects in their own precinct. The problem with this is that they're not necessarily allowed to share resources or costs between the precincts. Only about 10% of counties can share resources countywide. That's why when you look at the roads in Weslaco and you're like, why are these so awful? Part of it is there's just not the money sharing that could help fix the problem. Also, we want to make sure that they provide reliable public transportation in some areas. And also hire personnel and get contracts for various road and bridge projects. If you have a road that constantly floods, you may want to build a bridge to cover that problem. They control who gets to work on that project and the money that goes into bidding for it. Of course, if it's an election year, they're going to want to fix the potholes so they can get reelected. The county judge is in charge of handling the election results. They get the official results from the county election judges, turn the results over to the commissioner's court for any discussion, and then give it to the state Secretary of State for certification. So if it's really close, they may decide to hold a runoff election. If no candidate gets over 50% in a primary, that's generally when they have a runoff. They also serve as the county budget officer. They're licensed to perform marriages. They're usually only the county budget officer in a county with less than 225,000 people. You don't have as big a budget at that point. They also issue alcohol licenses for bars and restaurants, also liquor stores, and they preside over the county court. There's also the county sheriff. He or she works with the municipality police on various issues, appoints the deputies, the jailers, and handles the county jail system. Usually they don't work in the major cities unless there's a joint task force. So when you're kind of in the middle of nowhere in Hidalgo County, that's when you tend to see the county sheriff part. In the cities, it's usually City of Wesco or Mercedes or so on. So usually you only see county police on like county roads, secondary roads outside of the cities. There's also the county attorney to represent the county in court as needed. And they're in charge of prosecuting misdemeanor cases in the Justice of Peace and County Court. If you sue the county for some reason, they're going to represent them. If you're arrested for a misdemeanor like shoplifting, they're going to be the one prosecuting you in court. A funny story about county police. When we lived in Illinois, we used to live next door to a county. I don't know if he was a sheriff, but he was someone fairly high up. So one night, my older sister's out in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of friends drinking, sparkling like cider, stuff like that. That looks like wine bottles. This cop shows up and he starts harassing them, like, "Oh, you're drinking alcohol. Oh, you're making too much noise," like harassing everyone. So finally, my older sister just looks at this guy and goes, "Hey, do you know this guy named Rob, whatever?" And he's like, "Yeah." She's like, "Yeah, he's my next door neighbor." All of a sudden, the cop is like, "You know what? I think we're done here. I'm just gonna head out." Like, yeah, harassing a bunch of teenagers until you find out one of them's friends with the county sheriff. Not your best move. Yeah, and he's like, "I need to breathalyze you guys." And they're like, "Seriously, this is like sparkling juice. You can clearly see it on the label." It's just like, okay, we're done here. I don't want a full rank, but I will. Okay. Further down the food chain, there's also the county clerk. They're in charge of absentee voting. So for this election, for example, if you knew that you would not be able to vote because of illness, or you weren't going to be in the county, they were in charge of getting you your absentee ballot. They also record all of the legal documents, issue the marriage licenses, and they're the clerk at the county court and commissioner's court. They're in charge of things like trial transcripts, transfer of property, business licenses, and so on. There's also the assessor collector of taxes. They're elected in a county with more than 10,000 people. Otherwise, the sheriff serves in this position. They're in charge of collecting the county property tax, collecting the fees for license plates, renewals of car registration and titles. So this is why every year you have to get your car inspected, also get your car re-registered. This person serves as the registrar of voters, processing new voter registration cards, change of address, and so on. There's also a justice of the peace, a constable. They're in charge of handling minor criminal and civil cases, issuing subpoenas to show up to court. So if you sue your landlord for not giving you back your security deposit, they may issue the subpoena for your landlord to show up in court, and they may be in charge of handling the case and deciding who gets what. There's also the auditor in charge of overseeing the county's financial activities, looking for irregularities like money going missing or mismanagement. Then you also have these are elected positions, yeah. They're all elected positions except the assessor collector taxes in counties with less than 10,000 people. Yeah, these are all pretty much elected, yeah. So, good question. The other positions include the county school superintendent in the more rural counties, the county health officer to handle things like outbreaks of disease. Prior to COVID, they would handle things like outbreaks of measles, cough, flu, etc. And also the county agricultural agent. There's a lot of different positions that we don't necessarily think about, and most people don't necessarily pay attention to during elections. They kind of tend to be like, yeah, whatever, vote based on party lines and move on. Okay, so again, all counties in Texas have the same structure. This is both good and bad. It's good because at least, you know, if you move from one county to another, you're looking at the same type of government. It's bad because the needs of a county of 134 are very different than the needs of a county of 4 million. So again, it's both good and bad. And all elected officials are elected on a partisan basis. They run as Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians. Because we don't know as much about the candidates, we tend to vote along party lines. We just tend to vote straight Democrat, Republican, etc. The commissioners also tend to focus on the needs of the precincts rather than the entire county. Obviously, it makes sense on the one hand. They're the people who are going to re-elect you. If they're not happy with you, you're out of a job. But that does make it harder for them to focus on the needs of outside of their particular precinct. We tend to see a lot of arguments and a liability to hold them responsible. They serve as the board of directors for the county. So it's hard to hold an individual commissioner responsible rather than blaming the entire board. So sometimes one person may be holding up the process. We don't necessarily see that. We just say, why isn't the county getting this done? It is less bureaucratic than the state government, though. It is easier for us to deal with a county office. If you call your local Department of Public Safety, you are more likely to get someone to answer the phone. Call your local water company. You're not probably going to be on hold for 20, 30, 40, 120 minutes. It's going to be relatively easy to get a hold of someone. The downside of that is we don't tend to pay as much attention unless something happens. Most people in Mexico probably weren't terribly concerned about the lack of proper water drainage until we had a massive flood. Right? We don't tend to pay attention until we are impacted by something that they do. So it's hard for us to hold them accountable, but it's also hard for them to feel like we actually care when we don't really pay attention. If it's a competitive election, are more responsive. They're pretty much guaranteed to win. They may just say, yeah, thanks a lot, and then move on. In some ways, that's like state government. We just don't pay as much attention. If we're going to pay attention to any level, this should be the one we really focus on. We should really know who's running our county government, who's in charge of the city of Slico, or Mercedes, or Donna. Those elections just aren't as sexy. We just don't tend to pay as much attention. Okay. So one of the problems we see with this elected system is it's not the best management practices. We tend to see people appointed to various positions based on whom they supported the last election, whom they gave money to. So basically, you scratch my back, I scratched yours. The problem with this is that it can lead to a very high turnover rate. If a newly elected sheriff comes in and says, you guys were with the last person, you're out of here, brings in their own person, now you've lost that experience, that leader, and that trust. Then you have to start all over again. Then you have to deal with people learning the job rather than being able to just do their job. It leads to a very narrow representation of the population, usually one political party or one income group. So we don't necessarily see our needs being met. People who are good at their job sometimes lose it because they back the wrong candidate. It's also impossible for the county to buy supplies in bulk. Every department and commissioner has to make their own separate purchases for equipment and office supplies. It would be so much easier if, as a county, they could go to Office Max or Staples and buy things in bulk. Buy 200 pens or 200 legal pads or, dozens of items. It would save the county money. They can't do that. So they can't get those major discounts they get if they could purchase hundreds, if not thousands, of supplies. It also allows for bribery and corruption. There's also issues with construction projects. Fixing the roads is going to cross precinct lines. But getting the precinct officials to work together to fix the problem is very, very difficult. You have to get them to be willing to work together with each other, and that's easier said than done. And it's also hard to pass laws pertaining to the county. They can control issues like health and welfare, things like vaccination. But it's hard for them to deal with issues like pollution if you've got natural gas or oil in your county. If land developers are constantly buying up land to build subdivisions, thus adding more pollution. So they don't have a lot of control over the laws of the county. That's up to the state. Right. In terms of city government, in 1912, Texas created the ability for cities to have what was called municipal home rule. Basically, they can write their own charter for government and have their own policies, as long as these policies don't conflict with the state constitution or state laws. So Austin can't pass a policy saying marijuana is legal because that contradicts state law. But they can try to increase the minimum wage there to make it easier for people living in an expensive city. Cities do control unincorporated areas for about half a mile to 5 miles, depending on the size of the city. They can force developments to conform to city regulations on construction, sanitation, and utilities. They can force people to be on the San Antonio water. They can force them to have various soundproofing in apartment buildings, things like that. And this is done to help with what's called white flight. What we were seeing and have seen since the 1980s is white residents left the inner cities and moved to the suburbs. They left the city with less tax services. They were no longer paying city taxes. They still could use the city library, transportation, the airport, etc. So the problem was they were drawing on city services but not paying city taxes. Now they can't do that. Now they have to pay to use those services. They can't just take advantage of them for free. They do have to actually use them. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of different types of city government. One common type is called the council manager system. The number of members varies between 5 to 15, depending on the size of the city. So the city elects 5 to 15 members of a city council, and then that council appoints a city manager. The city manager here is not elected. They are appointed by the council. The city manager becomes responsible for the hiring and firing of the various department heads like water, healthcare, etc., and also helping to prepare the city budget. In this system, there is a mayor, and the mayor does preside over the council, but he or she doesn't have more power. They only have the powers of a council member. They can't choose to veto legislation. They can only vote on it. So the city manager has to go to these meetings, and he or she has to make recommendations on issues like taxes. Do we increase sales tax? What do we do about local property taxes? Utility rates. How much do we charge as a basic sewage fee or sewer fee that you have to pay for local water? Do we charge a base rate for electricity? We also have to tackle issues of zoning. Where do we zone commercial? Where do we zone residential? Can an area be rezoned as needed? So this is used in major cities like San Antonio and Dallas. system isn't perfect. Part of the problem is the council tends to have fairly short terms. There's an over-reliance on the manager. They tend to take what they say at face value rather than push back a little bit. Question their decisions. Also, they're not directly elected by the voters. They're chosen by the council. So there's less influence by citizens over things like who's in charge of a department, what the city spends money on. The citizens don't have as much ability to push for what they want in this type of government. They can ask for something, because the manager's not elected, they don't necessarily have to listen to what the people want. This form of government is very often compared to a business board. This is good and bad. It's good in some ways because it can be more efficient. It's bad because they tend to focus more on the needs of the business community. How do we draw in new businesses? What do we do about issues with the wage in a city? Or giving someone permission to open a particular type of business like a CBD shop or an adult bookstore. So there tends to be more focus on business and less responsiveness to the needs of minorities and poor. If you focus on bringing in businesses, you may not be focusing on building affordable housing. You may not be focusing on the needs of minorities if you're talking about shutting down minority-owned businesses to allow bigger companies to move in. So they tend to be a little bit too focused on business and not quite enough on the needs of the people in the city. An example of this is the cost of housing, right? The cost of living in Texas cities is going up, partly because people are relocating from more expensive states like California and taking advantage of the cheaper cost of living here. What inevitably happens, though, is prices go up as more people move in, so the cost of housing goes up and it pushes poorer people out of these cities. So cities like San Antonio and Austin have to take a good hard look at the fact that it's becoming more and more expensive to live there and how they're going to deal with the needs of the people who can't afford a very high rent in Austin. And how do we fix that particular problem? But we're still not as bad as some areas. Like in East Boston, they built studio apartments that cost $3,300 a month. Yeah, for a studio apartment. Before I left Florida, they were building this high-rise that's supposed to be like 87 stories in Miami, where the starting price for a studio apartment would be $2,500 a month. I would hate to be the person on like the 50th or 6th floor if the power goes out and you have to get back downstairs. Like, good luck with that. Okay, so another form of government that we see being used is called the mayor-council form. In this, both the council members and the mayor are elected. So they are more beholden to the citizens. We do have more influence on them because they are directly elected. And there's two types of mayor-council form. With the weak mayor-council, both the city attorney and the treasurer are elected. The mayor can't just fire them. Can't say, you're not doing your job properly, you're out of here. The mayor tends to be a bit weaker. On the other hand, less votes are needed to override a mayoral veto. So if the mayor vetoes something like local increase in the minimum wage, it's not as hard to override that veto. In a strong mayor-council, the mayor can appoint and remove city officials. So in this form, the mayor's unhappy with the city attorney. He or she can say to them, you know what, you gotta go. There's more power in that area. It's also harder to override a mayoral veto. So the mayor does have a bit more power in this type of government. He or she has more power over who's in what position. And this is both good and bad. It's harder to get things done in this type of government. There's less consensus. You're going to have fights over the city budget, over priorities. And if the mayor isn't able to work with the city council, they're going to deadlock more often than not. The mayor has to be able to get the city council to do what he or she promised. On the other hand, this is a full-time paid position. This is their only job. So it is their job to be responsive to constituents, to look at the issues and policies. Because this isn't a side gig for them, they are more responsive to the needs of the people of their city. And they tend to be better at their job, more knowledgeable about policy, more responsive. This can be beneficial. And this is the type of government that Houston uses. Any questions? Okay. So as a reminder, the research paper is due Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If you've already submitted it, you're good to go. If on Wednesday there's a problem with Blackboard or the Dropbox isn't working, just let me know, and we'll figure out an alternate arrangement. Any last minute questions on the paper? Everyone's good? Okay, so we're going to wrap up chapter 11 on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the other types of city government, special districts like school districts, water, etc. So again, papers are due Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If you have any questions between now and then, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. Stay safe. I think people aren't as crazy as I was kind of predicting with this election, but you never know, so just be careful out there. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.